I have a hard time
Here's a
saying I
question.
can't allow them to do those things. Or using eating as an example. I mean, eating. Think about all the people that die and all the problems and the financial cost to people that abuse their bodies through what they eat. Do we really want to go to the side where we say, okay, now the government is going to create like all these rules where they'll point a gun at you if you don't eat the right things?
Well, I don't think it has to always be a gun. A carrot is just as useful as a stick in many cases. I think maturing is realizing that Michelle Obama was kind of on the money about the school lunches, dude. We didn't have to be eating Little Debbie's oatmeal like cookies.
Well, well,
I think
well.
Michelle was kind of
Sure.
right.
Well, the problem is that anything the government does ultimately is a gun. Even if they're like, well,
I disagree with
we'll
that.
give you a tax break. All that is a wealth transfer at the point of a gun.
It's the topic of your space. I don't mean to take us way off subject. Um,
No, you're fine.
but I am interested because I think I probably represent a more Christian nationalist position than your own. Admittedly, I don't often associate myself with the label just because it's very fluid. There's not a prescriptive sense of the word. We don't know exactly what it means. It could mean anything from a theocracy to just like a greater involvement of religious morality in some of the laws of the nation. So I suppose, how do you see Christian nationalism? Is there an aspect of Christian influence in government that you are in favor of seeing more of? And where would you draw that line?
Oh, in a certain sense, I believe our government should be 100% Christian.
Based.
But that's one of the problems that you're gonna. Here's where you get into trouble, though. Well, first of all, what is the government?
Mhm.
And what does Christianity say about government? So one of the most fundamental things, and you can go back to Ezra Taft Benson's wonderful teachings on this, but he was just going back to people like Bastiat and others, um, who recognize that all the government is a tool of violent force. What is the government? It's the institution that makes laws, not suggestions. In other words, it says you will do this, or else someone with a gun will show up and make you do it, or they'll drag you off and put you in a cage. So I think the appropriate analogy for what a government is it's a gun. And the only question is, who are you going to point that gun at and why? That is the fundamental question behind the government.
Okay.
Um,
Can I
Go
ask an
ahead.
important kind of clarifier?
Of course.
When we look at kind of the verbiage, I not to be a stickler about the semantics, but I think they are important. I agree with this definition of government, or maybe of state. I don't, however, see all of those things necessarily in the idea of Christian nationalism, because the operative word is nation. A nation obviously is independent of the government, the kind of like enforcement structure. And I think that that's kind of the more important part here, and that's why there's also more fluidity in the definition. Christian nationalism does not necessarily mean, or does not necessitate certain kinds of enforcement. That could be pretty interpretable, but it does talk and speak to the character of the nation. What is its identity? And I think that's probably where
Well,
I feel that we
and
ought to
that's
advocate
where,
for it.
and you're right. In that sense, I am 100% a Christian nationalist. I believe I want a Christian, like I'm a Zionist in the sense of like the Latter-day Saint version of the term. Like I want the whole world to be a part of Zion, which is in my mind a voluntary community of people who cooperate to such an extent that the state becomes irrelevant and unnecessary because we don't need the state. It was Adam, or not Adams, it was Madison who said if men were angels, there'd be no need of government. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. So why don't we all try and be more angelic and be so angelic that the government becomes less and less necessary until it's almost unnecessary? That's what Zion is. People who voluntarily live in harmony with one another, uh, and there's no need for an institution of violent force because you don't have to restrict people because they voluntarily don't violate each other's rights. Now, is that a utopian vision? Of course. But what I'm saying, but we can get closer or farther from it.
Mhm.
We can be more or less angelic.
Okay.
And the less angelic we are, the more you need a gun.
All right. Okay. I really like this. I think that's actually a super good way to begin approaching maybe some of our different perceptions, or at least the policy prescriptions. I agree with you. That's the goal. I want this. I want to be able to live in a society where, the United Order works, where we've got a functioning order bill. But I do want that. I do want the Zion, but I also understand, and I think it is the historical reality as well with us Latter Day Saints, that in order for Zion to be created, you need some kind of structure. You do need a state that allows those interests to be protected by outside forces. You have to at least engage in a
You
kind of.
hit
Mhm,
the key word. You hit the key word. Protected. See, the government, as I view it,
mhm,
its legitimate function, the legitimate function of a gun in my own home, even,
mhm,
is to protect the rights of myself and my family and my fellow man. That's why I own a gun. That's why I own a lot of guns,
mhm.
actually.
I
Um,
like it.
and so that is my view of government and any government policies. And I do believe you are correct. You need to have a government that will protect people in their rights. And in fact, the great Latter day Saint story of injustice was the story of government being unwilling to protect the rights of religious minorities.
True. True. I think. Yeah. So we don't disagree there. I guess the issue is then, though, if you have, let's say, I mean, I don't know if you agree with this. I believe that America at its foundation is in its character as a nation, a Christian nation. I think the
Yeah, I agree.
separation of church, or I'll let you respond real quick. My bad.
No, I said I agree.
Sweet, awesome. We're on good kind of common ground. I think you and I probably both agree that people nowadays underestimate the religiosity of the founding fathers, and they overestimate and misinterpret the separation of church and state. One of my favorite quotes about this issue is John Adams, right, who says that the Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And that does not just say that, okay, the Constitution was like made for Christians or like religious people. It means that the Constitution ceases to function as something that unites and protects this nation's people if the people themselves or the character of the nation ceases to be religious. But the religion that they were talking
I
about was not just any, obviously. It was a Western Christian tradition.
Yes. Now I want to make a comment on that. I agree. Here's where the real danger is in the American system. At the root of the American system is the notion that human beings have rights, inalienable God-given rights that cannot be violated by the state. Okay, and like the human and that the government exists to protect those rights. Go read the Declaration of Independence. That's like literally what it's about. And so it the problem is when people and on left or right or Islamic or whatever, when you abandon the principle of liberty that the Constitution was, that the foundation of our nation in the Declaration of Independence was based on, that is, and those are religious sentiments. Those are metaphysical propositions made by the founders. When he says that this is only made for a religious sort of people, he's referring to that sort of the presuppositions of the American system itself. And the entire system will fall apart if the population, especially the majority of the population, lose faith in that proposition. And they begin to use the government as a tool of just whatever they want instead of as a tool to protect rights. Because that's the essence of the American system.
Um, okay, I think I can generally agree with that. I think though, it's like, do you also then support the idea that were this country to lose its Christian and religious character, the Constitution to which we are pledging this allegiance would not be able to provide for all of the people that it currently protects. Like that's kind of the risk that we run, is if we are willing to tolerate the legal dissolution of our national identity. Like, and I say legal in the sense of like that's the way the process is being wrought. Like, let's say legal immigration causes the national culture to shift in such a way that the population becomes so entirely different in its religious makeup that eventually this religious majority, whatever the religion may be, which is not Christian, calls for some kind of dictator. The Constitution would no longer be basically fit to protect the rest of the nation. The Constitution's utility is reduced by the simple fact that those people that the founders were talking about no longer comprise the majority of the country. I think that's the risk that I'm concerned with, is
Oh,
eventually.
I agree 100%. That is, I believe that the value structure of our nation is ultimately what drives politics. It's what drives everything. That's why I'm not. That's why I actually don't care that much about politics and policy as much as I care about sort of religion and culture, because religion and culture are what, well, I say religion drives culture and culture drives politics. And so um, the way I see it is that um, mass immigration, secularization, all of these things do erode the character of that you need to have in order to uphold the presuppositions of the American system. And I want to point this out. What is the core thing that is the sort of fundamental religious presupposition of the United States of America? In my mind, it's what it says in the Declaration of Independence. It's the notion
All
that
men are created equal.
all are created equal, and, but even more so than that, what it says is that men are endowed by their creator with certain
With certain
inalienable
unalienable
rights,
rights.
that among these
Yep.
are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted among men to protect these rights. And that, and
Mhm.
basically that's the only legitimate function of government, and when government abuses those rights, you have you have the duty to throw off that government. So my
Okay.
my whole point is, I don't, when you talk about, okay, the Christian religion, I will tell you there are Christians right now that I just was talking to an hour ago or two ago who reject that sentiment, and they
Mhm.
reject it claiming to be Christians. And I know, to
Mhm.
me, it's like, I don't care what religion you call it. If your religion rejects the religious presupposition of the United States of America, then you don't fit in here. This isn't your country. You are not an American. In America, you're an American to the degree that you believe in those central foundational principles found in the Declaration. And I judge your Americanness in how much you embrace those, and I embrace them because I believe they reflect the true principles taught by Jesus Christ about the nature of man and the nature of violence.
Okay. I think eventually the issue here, because we don't agree about a lot of the framing. The issue I think I see is that there are changes that occur nation, some of which are brought out demographically, because different groups hold different attitudes about plenty of issues. The thing that I asked Mehdi Hassan, right, is like, well, let's say there's a larger and larger swath of the population that becomes migrant. We accept more and more immigration, and eventually the immigrants favor a position that is completely at odds with what the Constitution says. I think that could be kind of that hypothetical can also be put into this conversation. I suppose the question is, do we tolerate a limitless legal disintegration of the Constitution so long as it's brought about like legally, so long as it's being brought about like under the framework that the Constitution has proposed? Where, what basis do we have as a nation to tell practicing Muslims who believe in female genital mutilation as a religious practice? I understand it's not all of them; it's a large, or it's a very small minority, or so I've been told. But who are we then? What grounds do we have to tell an individual that that kind of practice, that religious practice, is not something that we tolerate in the Western world? Do you believe we have that right? Can we say to those groups in Minnesota that they cannot continue with that practice?
So there's one thing to say that you should not continue with that practice, It's another thing to point the gun at them with the state. And so the question is at what point are you justified in pointing the gun at them? For example, people do all sorts of things to mutilate their bodies in all sorts of insane ways as grown adults. And frankly, a grown adult who wants to mutilate their body has a right to do so in this country. And I believe that that is by the Constitution itself. Now,
Can I ask a clarifying question
no.
on that?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Because it might be okay. Because it might be true that you're putting like a limiting factor here. Would you say that same thing about like transgenderism, for instance, that an individual who is attempting to change their biological sex through surgery, which it does cause, bodily like mutilation. I mean, that's the process of the surgery. Are you in favor
So,
of kind of a legal protection for that?
uh, 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 yes, essentially, because here's the thing: if you want to start pointing the gun at someone, right? You want to start creating legislation around that. You have to justify why pointing a gun at them is justified if what they are doing uh, does not ultimately harm someone outside of themselves. Person's right to swing their fist, they can swing it all over. They can hit themselves in the face all they want. It's when they start to hurt other people that in such a way that justifies pointing a gun at them. And so to me, if a person wants to get, and then you got the problem of finding a limiting principle. Like, okay, you say let's say we get enough people to agree that that it's bad for people to you know harm their own bodies as adults, and so then we say, okay, well, you know what? Then there's a bunch of people that a bunch of religious kind of zealots. They decide that oral sex is gross. And so then they decide to pass a law saying that you get thrown in prison for that. Like, and then there are people that are like, well, we don't think that we think it's too sexually inflammatory for women to wear, skirts that don't go down to their ankles. So, let's legislate that and point the gun at people who don't do that. Do you see how and I'm not saying that that will happen. What I'm pointing out is just the principle. Where's the limiting principle?
Mhm.
Why is it that
I
that is it just raw majority rule, or do we say why don't we just not point the gun at each other except for in the defensive rights when the rights of another are being violated?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I first of all, I want to say like for me, yeah, the biggest danger is that it could become a majority rule. I think that the character of the nation has already been established. I believe that we adhere to the Constitution, and I believe there's constitutional principles that ought not change and progress with time. Like I think there are certain freedoms that cannot change, even if the majority of the population seem to be inclined that way. If the majority of people believe the Second Amendment should be abolished, I still wouldn't support it because I believe in this kind of original intent framework. And I'm glad you said, it's not
And
necessarily
I, it isn't just about original intent though. It's because you really believe that you have a God-given right to self-defense. That's why you believe in the Second Amendment. It isn't just because people a long time ago said it and it was established. It's because it's a true principle to say that you have a right to self-defense.
True. You're correct, but I think it's also like, apart from the ability for us to dispute or debate fact, I think when it comes to our political paradigm, when it comes to, issues of constitutionality or what the legal precedent or standard should be, you have to like eventually get to a point like what's our level of analysis? How do we look at the Constitution? Is it a living document that progresses with its people, or does it represent what a nation was? And can we even today still support trying to retain the original nation, even if we are now further from that original nation than ever before in history. That's a whole like political discussion. What I would say to contextualize is some of the stuff you're describing. While of course the laws about the length of skirts or oral sex, those maybe are a little bit further from the reality right now. I understand the qualm about where do we put the standard. I would say that plenty of these restrictions actually have been the precedent in the United States, and that communicates the Christian nature of this nation. And like you look at I think there's 23 states in the country right now that still have adultery laws. Adultery is something that is that has been made illegal because that's a reflection of biblical morality. Adultery is wrong, and the context within which it has been seen as wrong is as a clear breaking of a commandment, both in the Old and New Testament. In the state of Utah, I think up until 2019, there was laws against premarital sex. It is absolutely the case that the nature of this country's laws are overwhelmingly religious. And that is why many of the original colonies had even statements of faith or confessions of them, or had their own statewide, respected religions, which differed depending on which part of the country you were in. But I would say that this idea of putting limiting limits that are religiously motivated on individuals' behavior, I think it's actually one of the most American things you can do up until maybe the
Yeah,
1960s.
but
And
I'm
I
not.
think
I'm.
under the
But
same
well, why would we presuppose that because it is a American thing that aligns with Jesus Christ's teachings? Did Jesus Christ want us to point the gun at people for committing adultery, or point the gun at people for having premarital sex, or did he want us to
well,
persuade them, not
I
coerce them?
this is an interesting question. I think the conversation of consequence isn't so much of an issue, right? Obviously, there is an internal consequence that people face for the actions that they have here. I understand this idea, this libertarian appeal to, persuading individuals and not making anything illegal that doesn't harm anyone but oneself. But societies and nations aren't sustained under that principle. What societies and nations rely on, and what we rely on in Zion, is the ability for a community to uphold certain standards. And it's interesting because I think that your
And
opposition is more so
this
with
is
the
an
use of force.
important.
Well, hold on. I think I might
Oh, go
even
ahead.
be saying
Go
what
ahead.
you're about to say. I think your opposition is more so using the state as that vehicle to put in place those standards. Whereas if it was on a community basis, if a community were to say, this is a value that we are not in accordance with in our community, I don't think you would have that issue. But I might be wrong.
Yeah, and that's and you're exactly right. The problem isn't that I do, it isn't like I'm okay. I'm not a libertarian as a life philosophy. That's the stupidest philosophy in the world for your life. It's a good philosophy for the use of a gun and the use of the state. The philosophy is you only use the gun to defend yourselves. You don't use the gun to tell other people how to live their lives, as long as their lives are not violating the rights of other people. So, what I would say is that a person who is engaging in those wrong things, Christ does want us to get them to change their behavior. He does want us to create a private society that even has social taboos around those things so that people don't violate the laws of God, and that we encourage one another and we don't accept as morally legitimate things that are not morally legitimate, because those things ultimately harm that person. And we love that person, and therefore we want them to choose what is right so that they can have a better life. But we don't point the gun at them and tell, because we have no right to point the gun at someone else. People are free to make dumb choices that hurt themselves. And so that principle of liberty and only using the state as a defensive mechanism is the basis of the American system, because otherwise, when you say, here's the thing, we have this gun and we can point it at people to make them do what we want. If we get the majority, let's point it at people and make them do what we want. That just is not what Jesus Christ taught.
I understand that. The issue is, I think that I don't believe there's a necessary support for kind of the suicide of your values and of your morality in a society. It's like this argument that we get into with, like, the Republican Democrat divide. It's like, well, we're not going to use the government in this way because that's what the Democrats do. Well, the Democrats are going to do it no matter what. It's like we can take a principled position, but at the end of the day, we might lose our country because we were trying to play more libertarian and we didn't believe in the overuse of state force. I think there's certain issues where we have created these problems because we've allowed that libertarian ideology in the way we use the state to go too far. The issues of pornography, the issues of drug abuse, the issues of all kinds of substance abuse. are something that we could easily mitigate using the force of the state. Think about the way that child pornography is regulated. Obviously, there's a victim in child
Well,
pornography.
I would say that for example, with pornography, you can make an absolute case that distribution of pornography to children is someone else harming children,
Well,
and it
what
should
about it to
be.
adults?
No, I believe that if adults want to do that, then they can.
Well,
Um,
we disagree here. I think that a society that protects the legal distribution of pornography is a society that is allowing legally for its decay. And I think there's no
yeah, yeah,
nobility in allowing for
but the
societal decay,
problem is,
knowing especially that
okay,
whether or
well
not
then,
it's the intention, that is going to affect millions of people, some of whom will inevitably be children. There's no way of avoiding it. You've allowed
you're
it
right.
to
You're,
seep into the society.
to a certain extent, there is some truth to that. But here's the other problem. Okay, you say that, okay, well, this is bringing about our social decay. Therefore, we take out the gun and we use the gun to fight this vague term of social decay. That was the same justification that the mobs in Missouri used to drive out the Mormons, because the Mormons were growing too numerous and they were creating a social decay on the state of Missouri. They explicitly said that. And
I think
so,
that's a bit of a stretch. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I think that
no,
there
no,
was.
that is the historical picture in the manifesto signed by the mobs for why they were driving out the Mormons and doing what they did. It was to preserve the good order and morals of society from a bunch of religious fanatics who were moving into their state and going to take over the institutions. So the
So
problem is that when you use the gun on someone else, once they get power, they will take that gun and point it back at you.
but
My thing
the
is
issue is the
to
gun is already pointed at us. That's the issue I'm coming at this from, is like we are the only ones who are not using the gun. The gun is being used against us and wielded against us through pornography, through societal decay, through
no, no,
immigration,
no,
or
no,
through
no.
plenty of
The
issues.
gun is the state. The gun is the state. The
The
reality
state
is
is
that
used
if we
against
want
us,
to,
either through soft or hard force. The state
you're right,
protecting pornography is just
and
as much a use of the weapon.
everyone in America who believes in the American project, and we need to persuade people to believe in the American founding and its principles, should turn on anyone on any side of the scale that uses the force of government for things other than the protection of rights. Because otherwise, all you end up in is a scramble to who can get the gun so they can point it at the other side. The problem when you say, let's use the gun because they're using it, is because that ends up creating an endless cycle of violence that you can see throughout history. The great American project, the wonderful thing that pulled us out of the cycle of tyranny that's been going on for millennia, was this experiment to say, look, what if we put down the gun and use it in the defense of rights? That is the idea, that people then can be left to be free. To be free is to not have a gun pointed at you by the state. And we're going to let people be free insofar as they don't violate the rights of other people.
Well, I think actually, Jacob, that's a pretty progressive way of understanding the liberty that is being referenced in the Constitution. There's some pretty conservative ideas, especially around the time of the founding, that believed that freedom was not so much your ability to do whatever didn't harm another individual, but rather your freedom to with the moral law.
Oh,
That does not mean
guy
you're.
there.
Oop,
Oh, sorry. Kind of, you broke up there for a second.
okay,
One more time.
no worries. Yeah. So the more conservative
Repeat what
understanding
you
of
said.
freedom is not so much the ability to do whatever you want that doesn't harm anybody else, but rather your freedom, or rather your ability to live a life congruent and do things congruent with the generally accepted morality, which in the United States is a Christian morality. The idea that you've
Let
positioned
me
is a
let me let
libertarian and
me
progressive
let
one.
can I no, I let me clarify, because I actually think we're on the same page here. My view of liberty is not that liberty is an end in and of itself. Okay? I've never felt that that's the case. Liberty is a precondition to virtue, because you can't be virtuous unless you freely choose virtue. That is the actual position of the founders and the founding philosophy. The reason we wanted a free nation wasn't so that we could have a bunch of degenerates doing whatever they want. The problem was is that you can't, if you don't grant people liberty, they can't choose
I
virtue.
agree.
A coerced virtue is not
I
virtue at
agree.
all. And so this is the double-edged sword of liberty. How will you use your liberty? Will you use it to be a degenerate, or will you use it to choose
Do
virtue?
you,
And we need to freely persuade people to live virtuously, because that is the mark of a Christian. They don't coerce people to be virtuous, they invite and persuade them
well,
to.
I actually I kind of disagree with this framing, but I would ask, do you think that we are eternally free agents? Like that our eternal nature, and in the eternities we are free agents?
In the sense that we can make choices between good and evil?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And you do not believe, I
But
imagine, that our ability to
uh
be free agents, or our nature as free agents, is compromised by eternal judgment and consequence.
no, the eternal judgment and consequence are the natural outgrowth of our behaviors. The thing that judges us is the
True.
law. The laws that exist in reality are what ultimately will punish us for what we have
Perfect.
done.
The
And
existence of
so,
the law and the punishment that comes through the law is not something that strips us of our existence as free agents. It is simply a consequence of the way we could choose to live, right?
but there's a difference between natural law or eternal law and the arbitrary laws of man that impose punishments arbitrarily and by us instead of the natural consequences of the things that you choose. If you are going to choose to do things that are stupid and wrong that hurt you, those things that are hurting you are the natural consequences of your own behavior, and you have every right to make that choice and to be punished by the laws of nature itself. On the other hand, if you go to harm someone else, then you have where the laws of the land of man have a right to defend others from your harming of them. That's the philosophical view of law and the way it relates, in my view,
Mhm.
to the restored gospel theology.
Awesome. I totally get that. Here's where I depart. The same way that the existence of eternal law, judgment, and punishment does not compromise our ability to be free agents, eternally or in our nature. In that same sense, I do not believe that a legal penalty for murder is a restriction of our temporal or our mortal ability to be free agents. I do not believe
Well, I
that a
don't.
restriction
I
on such a
you
thing as
can
pornography would eliminate our ability to be free agents or to act virtuously. Certainly, you would agree that you could always seek these things out. Making something illegal does not eliminate the opportunity for sin. It simply provides a punishment. But in the same way that an eternal punishment does not restrict our ability to be free agents, a temporal punishment is a reflection of it and equally does not restrict our ability to be free agents. It simply applies a larger consequence in the temporal.
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry, I might be losing
Oh,
you. Can
I'm
you hear
back
me?
now. Crap, I just went off. What was the last thing you heard?
Okay. Oh, I almost heard all of it. It was just the last little tail end of your sentence that I
Yeah,
didn't hear.
basically, in summation, the way that eternal punishment and eternal law and consequence does not restrict our ability to be free agents in the eternities, the temporal punishment that a government could impose does not restrict our ability to be free agents. It simply imposes a greater consequence in the more immediate future.
Okay. So here's I will say that I don't believe that your agency can ever be taken away from you.
I agree.
What can happen is in a fundamental sense. However, what can happen is there's a thing, it's coercion, which limits your options. That's the reason, you could use that same argument that you just made to justify the Soviet Union. They could say, well, we're not taking people's liberty away. They can choose whatever they want, but we've made these consequences that they're going to face. That doesn't take away their chance to actually be able to make the choice. They just got to face the consequences that we create
Yeah,
for
I
them.
believe that. It's like, yeah, I mean that is what
Well,
I believe.
but I actually believe that when you're using coercion to limit people's options um, through violent force, I think that you have to justify your doing of that
Okay.
with
Okay,
Christ,
perfect.
and that is the I don't believe that Christ allows you to impose his to impose by force any of his standards that he has for people.
Well, here would be the justification. It's that we already exist with a coercive force being pitted against us. The existence of pornography, its prevalence, the existence of drugs and their prevalence are already in nature coercive forces. They're forces that we are not
No,
even
they
equipped to
can be.
handle. And I think that in a society and in a context wherein we have coercive forces that are oppressed onto us, and I don't even think there's a debate about this. I mean, 99% of men have seen pornography before the age of 18. The average age of exposure is 9 to 11 years old, hardly past the years of accountability. I think that there is a very clear coercive force that exists, and an attempt to restrict those coercive forces in order to allow people, or rather make it easier for them to make good decisions, I don't think that's at all a problem. I think that's the responsibility of the state. I think it's our responsibility as individuals as well. Like if you're a parent, to make good choices as possible and as desirable to your children, and not provide them every bad opportunity or every opportunity to make a mistake, just in order to maximize their ability to choose, to like make the hardest choice, right? If you have a baby, you're not going to put the baby like in an environment where it's surrounded by knives and syringes. You're going to take away all the knives and syringes the best you can in order to allow the best chance for a life of flourishing. That doesn't mean that every single bad or negative thing that baby could choose or that child could choose is going to be eliminated, because I think it is in our nature to always be tempted, both by the adversary and also by our hope to draw closer to God. I, however, disagree with you. I don't think that a state could ever be so powerful in its restrictions as to seriously complicate our ability to live virtuous lives by restricting our opportunity to choose evil. I don't think a state could ever interfere to that great of an extent.
Okay, well, a couple of thoughts there. Number one, you brought up, again, pornography in relation to people that are under the age of 18. And I agree with you 100%. We should treat, in my view, what we would do with pornography is that any pornography on the internet that if a child saw it and got access to it, the parent should be able to sue the pornographer like into the ground, like so that they don't exist, which basically means that every pornographer out there would have to be forced to ensure that their product only ended up in the hands of adults, and through some sort of a verification process or some place where you had to be like actually ID'd and do that in order to view pornography. And so uh, that's that's the way it should be restricted. Now, um, now, as far as because I believe children have a right to be protected from sexual exploitation. Now, on the other hand, an adult who wants to choose to go and look at, boobies or something, like they have, I don't like it. I disagree with it, but I'm not going to point a gun at them and tell them no.
Would you at
I
least?
don't think it. I don't think Christ would be like, yeah, good. Here, brother Hansen. Here's your gun. Go out there, and anyone who looks at boobies, I want you to point a gun at them and tell them that they have to get in a cage for a week because they decided to look at some boobies.
I don't want to make a prescription as to like what Christ's policies would be, because I do think there's two important sides here. I think there's statecraft, and I believe there is like there's religious living. Obviously, I don't mean to separate them in such a way as to remove the religious self from public life. Like I think that's also a pretty blasphemous thing to do. But I do also think that there are ways to achieve a more Zion-like state, or rather, a state that is more conducive to the creation of a Zion, through a proper and an effective use of politics. I think one of those things is to limit
So
these
just
coercive
I
elements.
want to
Do you,
translate that. I
uh,
want to translate that for the audience.
yeah.
That essentially is to say that you believe that Zion requires the use of a gun in order to establish it in some way, or that it's good to use the gun to establish
No,
Zion.
I
I
think Zion
I,
could. I think
I
Zion can
believe the
make a
only
good
use
use of carrots. I think.
Zion is built on
Uh,
explicitly not on the powers of coercion, but the powers of persuasion. And so when you are using the gun to build Zion, you can use a gun to defend Zion, that's fine. But when you use a gun to create Zion, you're not creating Zion. When you're using coercion, you simply are not. That's just in the DNA of what
what
Zion
what if what
is.
if 1,000
And
members of Zion? Let's say Zion is made up of 2,000 people, and 1,000 members of Zion become atheist. Is there any amount of tolerable gun wielding in order to preserve the identity of Zion?
No, you aren't Zion when you have ideological separation between the people in Zion.
So, well,
So
but
Zion doesn't exist
well,
there.
but then you're saying that you've basically,
They're not
then in that
one.
example, you've allowed Zion to disappear because you were not able to prevent the trend.
Because you were not able to persuade people to live the laws of God. Absolutely.
And
Zion is always, that's why we preach the gospel. If we want to establish Zion, we need people to embrace Christ and voluntarily adopt the Spirit into their lives, transform themselves in the new image of Christ, and then persist in that new identity as true Christians. That is, and that is, Zion is emergent. It's not something you create from the outside in. It's something that emerges as a consequence of people um, transforming themselves, their families, and their communities from the inside out.
okay,
And so,
I think if you don't
that's,
mind,
go ahead.
I'd rather maybe depart from that example because I think it's too, I don't know if this is a word, utopic. It's too utopic to quantify in the kind of political terms that I think are more useful in the
Well, that's
conversation of
my.
Christian
But see,
nationalism.
that's sort of my whole point, though. My point is, if you want to transform a society and establish Zion, it isn't the political policy prescriptions. Political policy descriptions should, at their best, be last attempt be used to against to create. You don't create it with the gun. You protect it with the gun. You create the preaching of the gospel and society, persuasion and love. That is ultimately how you transform a society.
Okay, I understand that a lot. I think the issue we get back to is again, and by the way, I think it's something I talk about a lot, and I will be talking about hopefully with some more LDS people very soon. This idea of the laws of mercy and justice. I think when it comes to politics in our personal lives, I think we have much more room to be merciful in our personal lives, and I think we are far too often just excessive in our requirement of justice. But I think politically, especially the not to partisan it or make it partisan, but I think the Republican Party or right wing people in general, they tend to actually put less of an emphasis on justice and so much of an emphasis on mercy or more libertarian thinking that it tolerates things that are that frankly become unjust. And it is this idea that we do not exist right now in our political situation in this country or frankly in any country in a kind of neutral territory. We have plenty of coercive forces all around us, and they are exerting this force of a gun. And in this sense, I think I could almost, use your framework to appeal to you. I think I don't know. Maybe this will be a better question to get your read on it. Do you think that the existence of pornography and its prevalence in society, the sheer quantity in which it's being created and put on our phone screens, or just wherever we go, because it is unavoidable. Do you believe that represents a coercive force even to adults? You and I have, of course, obviously, and I think everybody in this call, whatever their politics are, agrees that it presents a dangerous coercive force to children. My issue is that I think it's also a dangerous and coercive force to adults. And I think that once addiction, especially things that engage with this supernatural stimuli that is far and away greater than what we ought to and what we have been kind of adapted to tolerate, I think that limits our agency in a much more dangerous way than policies do. Do you think, I guess to summarize, that pornography, yes, still is a coercive force for adults?
I actually think that there is a case that can be made there. And I think that's the right case you have to make. You have to say that this in some way is, um, it's so, it is almost a violation of rights of people's,
Yes.
but you have, again, it all has to be framed in that way. Now, can you make that argument? I think it may be possible. I would say I'm more agnostic on that one. However, I think
Okay.
that's the right framing to bring to the table if you want to use the gun to stop it. Now, I will say this,
Based.
though. I will say this. Um, I don't generally view pornography amongst adults as a uh, violation of your rights, uh, because I believe that you have the power within you to say no and to choose not to. The choice of an adult to engage in pornography is a choice, and you can choose not to. To say that you can't choose not to is, in my opinion, just it's like what we need. You want to know how you stop pornography? You stop the demand for it, because you prevent, first of all, people getting hooked on it when they're kids, and then you create a culture where it's just totally taboo. Like,
Well, I think
the
this is
reason it isn't that
mhm.
pornography doesn't exist because of the state. It exists because people are crappy, and because we have a culture that tolerates it. I am not. I'm for. What's really funny is that there's kind of a weird double-edged sword. On the cultural level, I'm very intolerant. I'm like, we need way more social taboos against things that should be taboo. But I'm big on taboos controlling the social norms of a society, and I'm not big on using the gun except for as a last ditch effort. And with the case of pornography, I do think there's an argument to be made, although I'm not over that line yet, to say that this could justify the use of the gun to stop it. But that's not my go to.
Uh,
I'm always really,
I
really slow to pick up the gun.
I think that's good. I think your disposition that way is good. I think you're very good faith in your approach to this, and I think your response to that last hypothetical shows that. It shows that your heart is in the right place. You need the framing to be consistent, and I empathize a lot with that. I think the interesting thing, and this is kind of again the libertarian thing. When I talk to libertarians, especially like paleo libertarians, eventually you've created a state in a community. You've created an enforcement mechanism. You're in favor of taboos. You're in favor of all of these things. You don't want the federal government doing them, but you're actually not against almost any of it, so long as it's done within the grounds of a community with shared common beliefs, values that are formally agreed upon by everybody. Here's the thing: the nation is that. If you take a holistic and a conservative view of nation, a nation is a people. A nation has a set of values and has an identity. To be part of America, you adopt those values, you adopt these standards. And I do not believe with this idea that you are equally American, regardless of how much allegiance you pledge to America. Your allegiance and your identity with America is important, and it is not something that is universally applied just because you have a social security number. And in that same way, I share your concerns, I share kind of your goal, but I believe that the same kind of community that you are describing, the same forces of social pressure, taboos, and even, the libertarians, the Hoppians would call it, I think, forced removal or something like that. All of these principles, I believe, can be applied at the level of the state to reduce the amount of negative coercion we face. That's my kind of guiding principle or guiding idea, is that we already face negative coercion right now in the status quo. We're just not doing anything about it, thereby making it as difficult as possible for good people to live good lives. We push people to extremes and addictions that are ultimately more limiting of their agency than a more restrictive policy would be. But I don't want to get too long-winded. I feel I'm repeating myself, but I want to say I respect you a lot for the way you've engaged with this issue, and I do hope that I can win you over, especially on the case of pornography. I think the big thing there is you're right. Pornography takes advantage of this innate urge that we have to procreate, but produces it and takes advantage of it in such a way that is so just grossly um, excessive that the brain literally is not equipped to handle it. That's what the idea of supernatural stimuli is. That's why people are obese. We have a natural desire to eat food, and now we live in a context where it is given to us in these enormous quantities. If you look at a person, it's like nobody should be obese, but there is an taking advantage of our natural disposition that is happening right now, and that's what I think we ought to limit. And pornography and obesity are kind of two big examples of it.
Yeah, I mean, and I can see certain arguments that can be made in that. I think that's a more respectable way to approach the situation when it comes to those. Okay, how do we justify picking up the gun? Okay, we have a supernatural stimuli, but I would still say that what that ultimately boils down to is these are great temptations. Um, I don't get to the point that you can't say no to them. I know a lot of people don't, but I'm not.
Well,
I'm not in
it,
favor of. Um, I don't know. I'm not necessarily in favor of, or think that I have the right to pick up the gun, and because there are people that just want to look at pornography and they just want to do that, and I have a hard time
here's a
saying
question.
I can't allow them to do those things, or using eating as an example. I mean, eating, think about all the people that die and all the problems and the financial cost to people that abuse their bodies through what they eat. Do we really want the to go to the side where we say, okay, now the government is going to create like all these rules where they'll point a gun at you if you don't eat the right things?
Well, I don't think it has to always be a gun. A carrot is just as useful as a stick in many cases. I think maturing is realizing that Michelle Obama was kind of on the money about the school lunches, dude. We didn't have to be eating Little Debbie's oatmeal like cookies.
Well, well,
I think
well.
Michelle was kind of
Here,
right.
well, the problem is that anything the government does ultimately is a gun. Even if they're like, well,
I disagree with
we'll
that.
give you a tax break. All that is a wealth transfer at the point of a gun.
It's
It says we're going to
but
give
it
you
no,
more of
it's a
other people's
carrot. It's
money.
a carrot, not a stick.
No,
I
no, no.
think
It's a
I
stick.
disagree with the
It's
framing.
a stick for
I
the
think
person
carrots
who has
exist and
to.
sticks exist.
It's a stick for the person who has to pay the taxes. Because guess what? You have to pay for other people's. The government isn't going to tax you equally. The government is going to hit you harder with a stick if you don't comply with their rules.
Well, I don't even think you have to raise taxes necessarily. I think you could just create a context where everybody making good decisions gets a carrot and some people just feel left out. And I think
Well,
that creates the social
where does
pressure
that?
that you said
The
would be
problem is
advantageous in improving
where
behavior.
does the government get its carrot from that it distributes?
You could find it in all kinds of things.
You're right,
But I think
taxes.
you're right. It commonly goes to taxes.
Well,
You're
that
correct
is
about that. I think it commonly
all
does.
government resources ultimately are taken by force from the population. The
Well, then
government doesn't do anything.
we could change the status quo. We could simply shift some of the appropriation of funding. That way, taxes wouldn't have to be raised. We'd just be shifting the way that we use them. That way, it's a morally negligible conclusion in the sense of raising taxes,
Well, if you're
but it is
shifting the
morally
funds from one
advantageous
group,
in a sense of
if you're
social
shift
pressure.
if you're shifting funds from one group to another, then the group that doesn't comply is getting hit with a stick because they have to pay the burden of the taxes
But
that's even higher than those that are complying. It's
you're
ultimately
not proving
always
a causal harm. You're proving a harm by um, you're proving only a harm by a lack of advantage. But that's not an explicit
no,
or a
but
hard use
the
of force.
advantage, the government is the one who's taking the money in the first place. If the government says, "Look, I'm only going to take $20 from you, but I'm going to take $50 from you because you don't comply with my law," the
Uh,
guy who's getting the $50 bill is who's getting the $50, high or the higher taxes. They're getting hit with a stick. The
Jacob,
government is just a tool of force and coercion.
Jacob,
It,
if the government, I don't disagree with that last part, but if the government is saying, okay, well, everybody's going to have to pay $50 as a sense of, tribute to the fact that you even get to live here, because the nation is to thank for the existence of the United States, right? Without a nation, the United States wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have the land that we're living on. So let's say we're taking already $50. You could say that's theft, whatever, but everybody's having $50 taken from them. Let's say that the state then says, well, we really want to try our best to improve the total fertility rate because it's something that interests us as the nation. So what we're going to do is take
no, no,
$20
no. It
less from
interests
families.
the
That's a
government.
question. No, hold on, Jacob. I want your response to that. What do you think if the government were to say, I'm going to take $10 less from families that have 3 kids or more? Is that the use of a stick or is that more of a carrot? And do you disagree or agree with that kind of thinking?
I'm totally against all taxation systems that are not ultimately a flat tax
Well,
based on consumption.
well, I'm not asking you about the rate of taxation. I'm saying, do you believe that a positive reinforcement, for instance, a tax write-off available for families who have three or more children, do you think that's a problem?
I don't think that that's the role of the state. I
Well,
think that
I
the
disagree. The state should
well,
be
see,
concerned
and
with
that's
families.
well,
The-
what the government is doing is it's then hitting the people who have to, because remember, there's a fixed set of costs in the government that the government has to pay for, and what it will do is it will shift the burden of its costs to the people who don't have children, and you say that's fine because they should
well,
have kids, and so the thing is again, it's to
uh,
use the state to force people to pay, basically saying, as the state, if you don't have
mhm.
kids, we're going to take more money from you. That's what
Okay,
it's
okay.
saying.
No, but it's actually not, and I'll make the hypothetical even more congruent with your worldview, so that you have to admit either you're in favor of this incentivization or not. Let's say that the government, who is already taxing everybody $50, says those families who have three children or more are going to have a $10 tax write-off. You're now only paying $40 if you have three children or more, and all of the cost, all of the burden is something only those who are putting these laws in place are going to be paying, and they'll be doing it entirely voluntarily. That way, there is no coercion or use of force. What do you say? Are you in favor of an incentivization structure like that, or are you against it?
My question is okay, now will the government have less money? Now that all these
No,
people,
because the cost is being provided, or the lack of revenue is being made up by the people who put in place the law.
what do you mean by that they're making up the revenue loss?
So the $10 that are not being paid by those families, those $10 of deficit in revenue are now going to be paid by the people who enacted the policy. And they'll be doing it completely consensually. That was part of their buy-in. Let's say the government's run by like very rich people, and the rich people say, okay, yep, we are going to
Well, yeah, if
we're going to
they're
front the cost.
so what they're doing in that case, in essence, is that those people are out of charity giving their money to cover the cost of people who have kids.
Uh-huh.
That is a voluntary charitable giving. That isn't even taxation. And so if people are voluntarily charitably giving money to families that have kids to cover more of their costs, I think that's wonderful.
Okay,
But that
awesome.
isn't taxation.
Here's the issue though. You don't have a problem with the idea of an incentive structure through the state. Your issue is more so just the taxation. But I mean,
No,
admittedly,
in that
that's not the conversation that we're having. Like the
but the
idea is
state
whether the state has
but but the,
the chance or has
Ty,
the
the
right.
state in that scenario, you could change the entire thing up. You could get the state totally out of it. You could just say, "Hey, we're just really charitable, rich people that want to have more babies in our society, and so we're going to give you guys, any one of you guys that have kids, we're going to give
Uh-huh.
you $10 to your tax bill
Uh-huh.
that you guys can use. So now you only have to pay $40 in taxes."
Yeah.
That's just you didn't describe something that the state actually did. You described something that private charity is doing.
And that's kind of like my point, right? Is the thing you're describing, it can be extrapolated to the state. The existence of communities and local charity can be extrapolated to the state, but at a certain point, you and I run into an ideological separation, which is that you do take a more libertarian perspective of government, and I believe more in a conservative, nationalistic kind of view of the state, right? Which is that there are certain responsibilities that we owe to the state. I don't think taxation universally is theft. I think that there is a certain amount of responsibility that we have and a stake that we have in the country. I don't actually have a big
Well,
problem with
I
taxation.
say it is. I believe that taxation is theft, but I think that some theft can be justified in the preservation of higher rights than property, like life.
Mhm.
And so, if you have to coerce people to pay for literally the defense that keeps them alive,
Mhm.
I think that that's a justifiable theft that can be taken.
Even if it's
Um,
something they're not interested in, even if they are willing to provide for their own defense, or do you think they
yeah,
should be able to opt
yeah.
out?
I don't think they can because I think that the
Then you're
preservation of their
violating their
life.
right.
No, no, no. You're right. I am. I'm violating their right to property and the preservation of their right to life and the right of all of our right to lives. I believe the right to life is
Uh,
higher than the right to property. That's how I
okay.
justify it.
I believe the flourishing of the nation also is significantly more important than certain increases to taxes. I think that the longevity of a nation, the flourishing of its people on net
So the right to
is often more
property,
important.
see, and here's why I have a problem with that. The flourishing of the nation as defined by the majority. So
Well,
basically any
I
taxes
think
are justified if the majority thinks that it will make us flourish as a
no, not
nation.
at all.
Like
I think
that's
it's more
basically
so.
what every leftist justification for every tax they ever
No,
pass. Let's pass this and then we'll flourish more as the nation. Therefore our theft is
I don't think
justified.
it's that necessarily. It goes back to the preamble of the Constitution and the enabling of the pursuit of happiness. And I think there's a pretty easy kind of philosophical framework as far as like statesmanship that can be made. I don't think you have to say like, okay, well the majority can just increase taxes to whatever. But I think this idea of the flourishing of a society in terms of fertility rate, in terms of national culture, all of that is extremely important. And what I think you might be underestimating is the ability of kind of the context that we live in, the society that we live in, to encourage our choices for better or for worse. I think right now
Well,
our
I think
choices are encouraged for the worse. And just I want to ask something super quick because this was from earlier and I don't want to
yeah,
forget it.
go ahead.
If you have the opportunity either to put the people of the United States or even to put your own child in a place where they will feel more temptation or less temptation, which do you choose?
Obviously less temptation, and I believe you can use the state to protect children.
Well, okay, let's say you have a son, but he's 18 years old. He's not a child anymore. Would you put him in a context where he suffers more temptation, or would you put him in a context where he suffers less temptation?
As an adult, I don't place him anywhere. He gets to choose where he goes, and I would hope that in my 18 years, I've taught him to use his liberty to choose Christ and to do what's right.
Okay, I like that. I think it is dodging the question a little bit, though, because we do live in a situation, in a context where we are facing temptation. Like we are facing plenty of issues. And what you would probably tell your son is, hey, you should not be friends with people who deal drugs. You should probably not hang around these places or in these spaces
Agreed.
where,
Those are the social taboos. Those are the social taboos that can transform your
and I
society.
think as a state,
But I don't need the gun to
but I
do
think
that.
the what I think the issue is that not everybody has a perfect father in their lives, and not everybody's going to have those social taboos created. A lot of people will just be the unwitting subjects to a society that encourages them to do evil unceasingly. I think that's the problem.
Which is why I believe that religion and the propagation of what we're doing each individual in society, not just for our own children, but also for the children of others in our community. It's the reason that I'm a seminary teacher. It's the reason that I'm constantly inviting people to church and everything else, because I believe that I don't just have a responsibility to my own children, I have a responsibility to my society. But I don't build Zion through the use of a gun. I build Zion, or I protect Zion with a gun, but I build Zion by going out in my family to my community outside of it and invite people in to participate in this new kind of society that, if it grows and is strong enough, can literally transform not only the American society but the world.
I
And so
agree.
that's where I see the thing is this.
I
I don't have a problem with government doing its job and playing its role. I just, there are the roles that you're giving to the state, in my mind, are the roles of the church. And the church, not only as a institutional body per se, but as the like body of
hold on.
believers.
I have
And
an important
our
question
job to
actually.
establish a culture.
Sorry, this is a little bit off topic, but it is super relevant. What do you believe the state's role in marriage should be? Do you think that the state has a right to say that marriage is only between a man and a woman?
I don't think that um, I don't think the state should be involved in marriage, but if they're going to, I would want them to favor what marriage actually is and not confuse it.
Well, but the union of like two men consensually is not hurting anybody. So why is the state using a gun to tell them they can't get married?
Oh, I think they would perfectly have every right to form a legal contract. But and those legal contracts, they can, the issue isn't they're forming legal contracts. The issue, the definition of what a marriage is.
I think, and this is again kind of where you and I
Are
have
you against? Are you
this very wait, say that. Sorry.
are you against two men forming a legal contract that they call a civil union that allows them, to form a contract of agreement about inheritances and basically all the same things that a married couple does? Are you against that?
Yes, I don't think that we should offer the same incentives and benefits to two men who enter a quote unquote civil union as we do to a married couple. I
Why?
don't believe in.
So
I think that the
why
mm,
why can't so uh, and so you believe that they should have to pay more in taxes and other things, um, and pay a higher cost because they're not in a traditional marriage? You believe that, and that should be imposed by the gun?
I would probably reframe it. I would say that they're not receiving the benefits that a married couple does because the married couple is receiving the benefits because they are in a marriage. The state does have a natural right and a natural, or not a natural right necessarily, but it has a naturally um, explicable interest in the institution of marriage. The easiest way for a society, for a state, for a nation to flourish is by having strong families, because strong families create strong new citizens who are, like you say, who have this moral and religious upbringing that inspires them to
And
do good by others, do good by their community.
I agree, but I don't agree with the premise that it's the government's job to incentivize families, because the only way the government incentivizes things is by punishing another person more than another by the force
Well,
of the
then,
state. It
then,
says
then that
if
hold
you
on.
don't, if you
Who decide to get married and have children. I'm absolutely in favor of that. And I
You're
think
right,
it's very
but I
reasonable
would,
because the
but you
state
have
is
to
going to
frame it
see it as a way
properly.
of perpetuating a flourishing society. It's the
You
easiest way
have
to
to
do it.
frame. You're framing it as that the married couples get a benefit. What I'm saying is taking unmarried people, doing it for the gun. If a person doesn't want to pay those additional taxes because the state is going to come to them and arrest them and point a gun at them. And my whole point is that's immoral. Christ
No,
never said,
I
hey,
completely,
if
well,
someone doesn't want to
hold
get
on.
married, you should punish them for it
Jacob,
and
I
take
think
their property from
I
them.
really, I just significantly disagree with the way that you're framing this conversation. Like we've done these hypotheticals a couple of times where I'm explaining to you, like, okay, so here's the case. Everybody's being taxed uniformly, and then there is simply a benefit added to one group, and you are refusing to see that as anything other than like force being used against the other group that's not receiving the benefit. But I think that it's really
You're right,
important to understand that hold on, but there are two ways of using state force. There's a hard force, there's kind of a soft force, and there are advantages and there are like ways of advantaging people, and there are ways of like directly and specifically disadvantaging others. The issue is that
in the
these two
government.
things are
Remember, the
separate. You
government
keep
has
conflating them. The use of force is not the same thing as the
no.
provision of an incentive. It's not. They are two entirely different things.
You see, but you're not understanding is that the government is a zero sum game. The government does not create wealth; it can only redistribute it. That's all it's doing. And so, if you a a putting on the government for a certain number of revenue that the government has to generate, and it's equally distributed amongst all citizens, right? But what we're going to do is we have the same.
I don't know if it's just for me, but you're cutting out quite a bit. I don't know if other people in the chat are also hearing him cut out. Might just be me. I'm in the gymnasium.
Clear a bad spot here. Let me see if I can get through it here for a second. Can you hear me
I'm
now?
hearing a little better now. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, I should be coming out of the area here pretty quick, so I'll try and sick through it. So my whole point is this: if if everyone, let's say everything's 50-50, everyone pays 50%, but then you decide, and that covers all the nation's costs. If I drop the tax rate on half the country by 40%, I'm going to need to increase it. Otherwise, I'm going to have a deficit. I'm not going to be able to cover the costs of the nation, right? And
Let's
so
hold on.
if
Let's make
you're
it
going to
let's make it
offer
easy.
an advantage to someone, if you're going to offer an advantage to someone, it offers a disadvantage to someone else because they have to pick up the slack.
Can you conceive of
That's
any
just,
possibility of generating the lost revenue through a means other than taxation?
if it was other than taxation, it would be voluntary, and that would be
How about
charity. That
no?
wouldn't be
I
taxation.
disagree. How about this? You're increasing the amount of trade that you're involved in, increasing national revenue. There is no loss to anybody who lives in your country. There is a pure benefit to
Well, then
people who are doing what you are
why
trying
don't
to do.
you, okay, so if you're going to increase national revenue,
To
then
make up for
you
the
should be
deficit.
able to lower the tax. You can lower the tax rate on everyone,
But I don't want. But I don't
and
want to do that.
then that's my
No, no,
point.
no. Hold on, hold on, hold
What
on,
you
hold
want
on.
to do is you want when you give someone an
Uh,
advantage and someone then to balance things out, if it's not equal,
mhm.
then what's happening is then some people are being uh, disadvantaged, and I'm
100%,
pointing out
100%.
that,
Do you?
well, and that's my point. You are punishing. It isn't just I'm giving someone an advantage. In the government, if you are giving someone an advantage that someone else has to pay for, don't forget about the person that has to pay for it.
Well, what about what do you think about religious exemptions or like religious write-offs? Do you think that that churches should be able to have certain tax write-offs that other institutions don't get? Or do you think that that is going to be providing too much of a favor to them to the disadvantage of other non-religious groups?
I don't believe that the government should have any power over because the power to tax is the power to coerce, and I want the government to tax as little entities as possible. So I'm happy whenever any institution is exempt from it entirely, simply because I want less people to be taxed. But
Would you
that's
then be in favor? Would
and
you then be
so
in favor of, in order to be consistent, would it be better and more perhaps again morally consistent or at least ideologically consistent to remove exemptions from everybody? That way
um,
nobody's being
to
unfairly
remove.
advantaged or disadvantaged.
Well, I think all taxes should be shared equally on individual citizens, not on institutions, and
Well,
it should be based on
well, why not
a
on
flat rate
institutions?
consumption tax.
I agree with you, by the way. I like the tithe tax idea a lot. Dr. Ben Carson was actually he was spitting about that, and so was Jesus. But why not
Yeah,
institutions?
because I think that it is. Well, I don't think that institutions should be taxed as institutions. I think individuals should be taxed based on a flat tax for consumption. So if we're talking about ideal tax structures, that's what I'm going to talk about. But I would say that the uh, religious institutions, if they can be exempted, exempting institutions is different than exempting individuals, so far as I can tell.
True, but you're offering unfair advantages, which by your logic that there is no use of a carrot, there's only use of a gun, is the use of a gun against other institutions who are not receiving the exemption.
Um, to a certain extent, I can see that, and I'm okay with that to some extent. But I'm
Oh,
trying to think through. But I'm trying to think through where with individuals it's a little bit different. Um, because, well, I don't know. Let me think about that. That's actually a good point. Actually that is a good point. I'm trying to think through my logic here. I'm like genuinely like been thinking about so many things during this drive.
dude, hey,
Um,
I'm all here for it. And I think, by the way, thinking about it is super good because I think, Plato does this with his Republic. He says, well, if we're looking for justice, what is, where do we first observe it? And he has difficulty observing it in an individual. So he says to his buddy, Eurymachus, or no, I don't think it's him at that point. But anyway, he says, well, let's look at the society. I think it might be easier to observe it in a larger context. And I think in that context and in this discussion, it's easier to observe the role of the state when we look at the kind of institutions the state supports. That's why I think this is probably a more difficult issue, because at the individual level, yeah, you're right. It's pretty difficult to draw those lines. But I think institutionally, most of us are probably well inclined to say, I think that the state
The
should,
way I
kind of provide those
the way
incentives
I
to
look at it
churches.
is that the state I would frame it as I think more about it. I think the way I would play it is that the because I believe in a quote unquote separation of church and state, I believe that taxation gives state power over religion, and I want religious institutions to be completely free. Like I want them to be detached from the system entirely so that they can freely operate. And so in that way, I don't know that it's so much that they're getting an advantage per se, although they are. They're getting a total detachment from the government system entirely. I think that I do believe that that should happen as sort of a fundamental issue that goes beyond that of an individual. Because an individual, if everyone's being taxed, uh, like I would have a real problem if the government was taxing some religions more than others. So, for
Uh-huh.
example, if let's say the government did impose taxes on religions, would you support laws that said that Muslims have to pay 3 times as much tax as Latter-day Saints because their religion is less healthy for our society?
I don't think that's the way I would go about it. I would go about it probably like in the other sense where it's like I would ban female genital mutilation, because I think there are important boundaries to be drawn around, like, I believe in some sense in the elements of a pluralistic society, but I don't believe in them absolutely. I don't think that
But
any
you don't.
practice does.
I was about to say you certainly don't believe in. You'd be as libertarian as could be if you had a bunch of religious zealots take over the country, and they
Well,
all of a
I
sudden wanted to impose their Sharia views on you for what is like you're eating a bacon is all
mhm.
of a sudden illegal, and all of a sudden you'd be a libertarian
Here,
hardcore.
here's the
My point
difference.
is that everyone's a libertarian when they're in the
I
minority, and I'm saying is that when you're in the majority,
I
at
oh,
some point you will
you
be in
cut
the
out again.
minority. So why don't we all just agree?
Mhm.
Sorry, I was just saying that at some point we're all
Yeah.
in the minority. That was the whole classical liberal idea is when it's to be in the minority because the society will sort of tolerate you as long as you're not violating other people.
Mhm. I think
Not okay to be in minority,
that's actually.
then if it's not okay to be in the minority, then you better freaking get that gun. Because if you don't hold it, someone else is going to point it at you.
I actually 100% agree, but I disagree with the idea that I would be a libertarian if I was in the minority. If I was in the minority, I would probably, because the thing is, it's not like this blanket authoritarianism. Like, I don't believe it's like authoritarianism in a vacuum is good. I think it very, very much matters the kind of things that you're imposing authority about. It absolutely matters. And
You,
like I've been
you're
trying to demonstrate
you're
here, I think there's positive social. Am I breaking up?
no. I was just going to
Oh,
say that is. Oh, can you hear me?
yeah,
Can you hear
yeah.
me? Am I coming in? I was just going to
Now
say
you are. There's lag,
it,
but yeah.
but everyone thinks that their view is good for society. The Islamists, everybody. And
Hmm.
so the problem is it's just like, well, I think authoritarian's good when we are the authoritarians, and it's like
Uh,
that's what the other side says too. And so it just
100%.
devolves into this fight over who has the gun and the power.
And here's
And
the issue.
I
Here's
want
the
to get
issue.
out of
If
the endless power struggle.
if you're the only group that says the moment I can get the gun, I'm not going to reach for it, then you'll be the first group to die. And I do not think that there is something noble in allowing Christendom and allowing Christianity in the West to be destroyed because of its incessant need to practice the libertarian ideology. I don't think that's even what Christ would ask.
It isn't the libertarian ideology.
Well, it
It's
is.
the
It's the
American
it's
ideology.
no.
It's
I
at the
completely disagree.
it's what the Declaration of Independence is all about. The idea
One
is
of the
that
first things.
governments exist to protect rights.
Yeah, but if you look at what the government did, the government put in laws as to who could be an American citizen, and it was only free white men of good character. The
Oh,
government
I
put
don't claim for
restrictions
a
on
moment.
immigration.
I don't think for a moment that the foundation that at the beginning of the American nation we were living the principles of the American founding. That is absolutely clearly not the case. And the great struggle of our nation is if you can live up to the high ideals of the Declaration of Independence.
I agree
And
with you that we
so
weren't always living them, and I think
because but
there's certainly changes that come about that put us more closely in line with them. I think one of those, for instance, is the abolition of slavery. But I also think that it is a mischaracterization to say that the founding intent of the nation was more libertarian than what many of those same founders did while they were in office.
it was the foundational vision of this nation, as found in the text of the Declaration of Independence, is absolutely on the government level the preservation of liberty. You want to call that libertarian, call it what you want. Government was meant to be restricted, limited, and only allowed to protect people's rights. And then, but then on the other
Well,
side, on the cultural
hold on.
side,
I want to draw a
remember,
distinction
there's a
there,
difference between government
but
and
there's a
culture.
distinction there.
I reject
You're
I
talking,
reject
Jacob,
your
about the
I
federal
reject
government.
cultural
What do you
libertarianism.
think about the state governments? The state governments were much more restrictive. I agree with you that the federal government was not developed in such a way as it is now, but the state governments were absolutely more restrictive on those matters.
Yeah, and I think that's a bad
Well,
thing.
but now
Why
you're
do I
going back on
assume
what you
that?
said. You're basically saying, well, the founding was this, and that, and it was not this large federal or executive branch. But I'm telling you, okay, sure, but it's only because they delegated those responsibilities to the state governments, which were more easily responsible for the citizens closest to them. And you're saying, well, I
And I
disagree with that.
agree, and I agree with that system. Extermination orders on our people. So I don't look historically at the laws passed by individual states. And I look at the laws standard by judges. I'm judging them according to the principle. Is being used? Is the gun being used in defense, or is it being used as in offense? And I do not agree with essentially any laws that are used in an offensive manner. That enforce um, social norms that uh, that help people to avoid vice and seek virtue, so that we can have a more virtuous society, not by force of state, but by choice, by a free citizenry that have a healthy culture.
Okay.
That's
I like that. I
that's
like
my
that.
view.
I think this is probably that was a good closing statement. I don't know if you want that to be a closing statement, but I took it as one, and I think it's a good summation as well of your beliefs. I think in juxtaposition, the way I would round this out is I'd say I think that the nation plays an important role in shaping not just the laws, obviously, or the state, I should be more clear about my language. I think the state has an important role, obviously, in determining the laws, but also in shaping society's culture. I think the state and the national culture, and then in the composition or the nature of the state or of the nation itself, all of those things are intertwined. I don't believe that any man is an island. I don't believe that any community is an island. I think we're absolutely intertwined with all the people who live in our country, and eventually the practices even of adults in the privacy of their own home will influence national culture in such a way that might be coercive and certainly negative to even more people. And I think we have an opportunity to shape the state, and to use it in such a way that encourages righteous living and reduces the amount of unnecessary coercion in people's lives. And I think that is the vision of at least the kind of Christian nationalism that I am a fan of. It is the use of the state to reduce unnecessary coercion and to enable more people to live good lives. But I want to thank you, man. I appreciate the conversation, and it's very it's
Yeah, it's
very
been
rare
great,
too
man.
that you'll come across somebody who you can tell is not just like waiting to say something, but is actually like listening. And for that reason, I've actually loved this conversation a ton. I have a bad habit often of jumping in and interrupting and trying to, get my thing out before I listen to yours. So I apologize for having done that quite a bit, but I appreciate it.
No, I'm the one who's bad at that. What are you talking about? Everyone's going, wait, Jacob was the one who did that,
Well,
not
hey, man,
Kai.
I love you, dude. It's great to connect seriously, and it's cool to see the interesting perspectives even within our same community. I will say, I don't know if you caught it in the new Jubilee video with the Protestant girl, Allie Bethy Stuckey. There was another
Uh
member
huh.
of the church, but unfortunately, we're two for three now. The member was part of the
Oh,
liberal Christians, and well,
oh,
we might
great.
not agree with her perspective, but hey, that's all right. We're not a monolith.
Right
Anyway,
on.
love you,
All
big
right.
guy. Thanks
Well,
so
thanks so
much.
much, Kai.
See ya.
Appreciate you. Take care. Bye bye. All right.